Welcome to this masterclass. Let me begin with an observation that may save you hundreds of hours. UPSC no longer evaluates history as chronology alone. Now, be careful here. Chronology still matters. You cannot write a structural sound answer without knowing when things happen relative to each other. So, sequence matters because cause has to come before effect in cause and effect. So, but increasingly the examiner rewards interpretation, institutions, and structural change. History in this exam has become a way to test your understanding of society, understanding of governance, understanding of political economy, and long-term transformation. So, apply this test to your own preparation right now. If your preparation is still limited to memorizing dates, agreements, and personalities, you are preparing only one layer of the paper, and that layer alone will not get you the marks you need. So, two quick examples here. If you treat the 1857 uprising as a sudden military event, you are missing the deeper question. If you remember the Quit India movement as just a date and a slogan, you are missing the deeper question. And in both cases, the deeper question is the same. What pressures created the event? Who responded? So cause and consequences as well as stakeholders. And what institutional or political consequences followed. So I'm not telling you to abandon chronology here. I'm telling you it is the skeleton necessary but not sufficient. Skip the dates entirely and your analysis has nothing to anchor to. So, but the marks live in what you build on top of the skeleton. So, look at the questions from 2013 and 2013 to 2025. And a pattern emerges that chronology remains the skeleton, but interpretation increasingly decides the marks. UPSC is not asking you merely to describe the Quit India movement. It wants the conditions that produced it and the consequences that followed. Like I've said earlier, causes, nature, stakeholders, and consequences also. It is not interested only in Lord Curzon's list of policies. It wants to know how his administrative decisions reshaped the nationalist movement and the ripple the effects, not just the actions. So we have to evaluate the Lord Curzon's policies rather than evaluate of Lord Curzon. So here is what we will do today. We are going to take our time. This is a comprehensive session, not a race. We are going to open up 13 years of previous year's questions across three domains of the content. That is modern Indian history, post-independence consolidation, and world history. And then turn all of it into a single answer writing engine you can run in the exam hall. This is all belongs to GS paper 1 mains, belongs to GS paper 1 mains and history part. So, and instead of treating these questions as isolated unconnected things, which is how most students experience them, we are going to organize them into what I call question families. Be clear, about why. The goal is not prediction here. I'm not telling you this exact question will return in the examination. That is not our goal. The goal is pattern recognition, so that when you walk into the exam hall, you no longer see a random unfamiliar question. Why? Because you see a structure here, a structure you have already practiced, already understand, already know how to solve. So let us begin. Let us begin with modern Indian history from 2013 to 2025 PYQ structural autopsy, structural analysis. This is also called as the structural autopsy. So, all right, let's get into the first major block, that is modern Indian history. And I want to start with one observation that once you absorb it, changes how you read every PYQ in this section. PYQ, that is called as previous year questions. UPSC is not rewarding event narration anymore in the form of answer. So read that again also. You have to read that again also. This line particularly. Not rewarding event narration. UPSC is not rewarding event narration anymore. So what does that mean in practice? It means that if your answer simply describes what happened, even if every fact is correct, even if your dates are perfect, if you even you are answering a different question that one being asked, because that days are gone. Now they are asking about analyze, evaluate, comment, that type of questions they are asking. So discuss like of questions, like explanation, explain the questions, what has happened, what happened, and every fact describes that days are gone. So you are answering a different question that than the one being asked in the paper. So what is being asked? Look at this chain ideas, then structures, then social response, then institutional outcomes. This is not a checklist. This is actual shape of what the examiner wants to see on the page in the form of your answer. When an idea or policy enters, it creates or collides with a structure. Society responds to the structure, and that response hardens into an institutional outcome. So every high scoring modern history answer, whether it's about Gandhi, about famines, or about 1857 revolt, moves through that same shape. What is the shape here? Ideas, first and foremost, ideas or policies, then structures, then social response, then institutional outcomes. This is the structure. When the idea comes to the policy in the form of structure, then the implementation, the social response will erupt, then the institutional outcomes. So an idea or policy enters, it creates or collides with a structure. Society responds to the structures, and that response hardens into an institutional outcome. So keep that chain in your head. We will come back to it again and again, because we are going to dig deeper answer writing session in the end. And one thing before we go further, because it will save you from a lot of anxiety today. Why? You are going to hear me name a lot of chains, that is era models, families, engines. Do not try to memorize them all as you listen. Memorization is no reward here. By the end, you will see they are all the same four beat shape wearing different words. Those are ideas, structures, response, and outcomes. So listen for the shape, not the labels. If you walk out remembering one four step habit, you have got the whole session. That is the actual purpose of this session. Now, to show you this is not just theory, I want to walk you through 13 years of papers from 2013 to 2025. That is not randomly. That won't be randomly because the papers themselves have evolved in some pattern. UPSC in 2013 was asking a different kind of question than UPSC in 2023, even when the topic looks identical on the surface. Early papers asked you to describe, later papers ask you to judge. So that is the difference here. You have to understand that. And one thing sets this subject apart from the other two we will cover. Why? Because unlike post independence and world history, modern history appears every single year. In 2013 to from 2013 through 2025 without a gap, every year single question, at least single question will come from world modern Indian history. It's the spine of the paper. So we are going to break it into three eras and we are going to discuss into the spine of this history. So this is era number 1, belongs to 2013 to 2015. That is called as foundation of national consciousness in the form of asking questions in UPSC CSE paper 1 mains GS. So let's start at the beginning in 2013, 14, 15. Look at these 3 years together and one logic runs underneath them. That is leadership, then ideas, then mass mobilization. For that, let me take in one 2013 question. In 2013 question, the questions touched on the role of women in the freedom struggle and foreigners who made India their homeland and joined the movement. And then Lord Dalhousie as, in essence, the founder of modern India. These are the questions asked in 2013. Then 2014, you had the various facets of British economic policy from the mid 18th century till independence. They asked on British economic policies facets. The naval mutiny as the last nail in the coffin of British colonial aspirations. And the world developments that motivated anti-colonial struggle in India. A flag on the naval mutiny, that is the 1946 RIN mutiny, that is Royal Indian Naval Mutiny. So strictly it's late transfer of power topic. It sits a little outside the era's consciousness, emerging frame. And we will see it again in the subaltern family. Keep in the back of your mind as far as this question is concerned in 2014. That is RIN mutiny. In 2015, the questions turned to Gandhi. In 2013, they asked about women in struggle, freedom struggle, Dalhousie, founder of modern India. Then 2014, they asked about economic policies of British. Then 1946 RIN mutiny. In 2015, they turned to Gandhi. How difficult independence would have been without him. And to shared goal of Gandhi and Ambedkar in uplifting the downtrodden, despite very different approaches they have. So the questions have been changed from year to year. Now ask of every one of this. What is the evaluator actually trying to find out across all of era 1? Think once. The answer is the same. How did anti-colonial consciousness emerge? They asked, how did anti-colonial consciousness emerge? Not what happened in 1857, not what did Dalhousie do, but how did a shared sense of grievance and identity come into being in the first place? That is foundation of national consciousness. And notice one thing, even an administrative figure like Dalhousie is being asked a source of grievance, not as a list of policies. That is the question you have to understand. So the mental model for this era is simple: idea, then movement, then political expansion. An idea, what is meant by an idea? Indians deserve self-rule. Untouchability is a moral wrong. Takes root. That idea becomes a movement with leaders and followers. And that movement expands, pulling in new groups, new regions, new demands. Anchor a 2013 to 2015 answer in that idea to movement to expansion logic, and you are already ahead of the every aspirant still listing facts. So the mental, you have to understand the mental model of this era 2013 to 2015. They asked regarding foundations of national consciousness, then expansion, then movement, then political expansion. Then comes to the era 2, that is belongs to 2016 to 2020. This era is called as conflict, structure, multiple paths. Now the tone shifts: conflict, structure, multiple paths. The logic here is nationalism, then debate, then expansion. Notice that word, please. That is debate. Era 1 asked how consciousness emerged. Era 2 assumes it has emerged and asks, was it one unified thing or was it contested, pulled in different directions by different people? So 2016 gave us Bose versus Gandhi in their approach to the freedom struggle and the role of women during the Gandhian phase. And the 1857 uprising framed as a watershed in British policy. In 2016, they asked these questions: Bose versus Gandhi, women during Gandhian phase, and 1857 watershed in British policy. Then 2017, they asked four questions. This was heavy here. The questions like this: the failure of the moderates to carry conviction by the end of the 19th century. The failure of the moderates to carry conviction by the end of the 19th century. Then the decline of the traditional artisans industry and how it crippled the rural economy. This question you have to be more cautious. The new objectives added to the vision of independence since the 1920s. And a question on how mid 18th century India was beset with a fragmented polity. That last one is the one added one out. It is really a rise of British power, pre-consolidation topic, and we will park it as alongside as the 2022 question on why the company's army kept winning. I will repeat it again. For 2017, they asked failure of moderates carry conviction by the end of 19th century, and decline of traditional artisan industry, then it crippled rural economy, and objectives added to the vision of independence since 1920s, and a question on how mid 18th century India was beset with a fragmented polity. These four questions they asked. Comes to the 2018 asked you to reflect on the significance of Gandhi thought in the present times. Again, 2019 was a big year for this era. 1857 as the culmination of 100 years of smaller rebellions. The linkages between the 19th century Indian Renaissance and the emergence of national identity. The many voices that enriched the movement during the Gandhian phase, and the role of British imperial power in complicating the transfer of power in the 1940s. This is the big year, and the questions have been forwarding from the chronology. Like 1857 as the culmination of 100 years of small rebellion. The linkage between 19th century Indian Renaissance and the emergence of national identity. This is a beautiful question. This is question asking on socio-religious reform movements. The many voices that enriched the movement during the Gandhian phase, and the role of British imperial power in complicating the transfer of the power in the 1940s. Then 2020 gave us Lord Curzon's policies and their long-term implications. And the idea that since the 1920s, the movement acquired various ideological strands and expanded its social base. These are 2020 questions. So, when observing from 2016 to 2020, so what is the evaluator asking here? Was nationalism a single movement? And the answer UPSC wants you to arrive at is no. It was negotiated and contested. Gandhi and Bose disagreed on strategy and approach. Gandhi and Tagore disagreed on what nationalism even meant. Moderates and extremists disagreed on method of struggle. Women, tribals, peasants, industrialists, all pulling the struggle in slightly different actions at once. That is independence. So the mental model for era 2 is policy, then social fraction, the political response. A colonial policy, the partition of Bengal, revenue policy, repression after a movement creates a friction, that is revolt. Different groups respond differently. Those different responses become different political strands within one broader movement. So if a question gives you two figures, two movements, two ideologies, don't write both were great leaders. Write about the friction between them and what that friction tells us about how complex the nationalist project really was. Contrast is need of the hour rather than similarities. The mental model for era 2 is policy, then social fraction, then political response. So a colonial policy, the partition of Bengal, revenue policy, repression after a movement creates friction. For that response, different groups respond differently. That is called we are rebels, rebellion, revolt, etc. Those different responses becoming different political strands within the broader movement from different sectors of the country. So if a question gives you two figures, two movements, two ideologies, don't write both were great leaders. Write about the friction between them and what the friction tells us about how complex the nationalist project really was. We have to focus on contrast when you ask the question between the two leaders. Then comes to era number 3, that is 2021 to 2025. This is era 3, called as systems, subalterns, institutions. Now this is the most recent era, and the one of the most and the one most of you will actually be examined under. So please pay close attention. The logic here is institution, then society, then administrative legacy. The era 1 was consciousness emerging, that is national consciousness emerging. The era 2 was that conscious being contested. Then era 3 asks, what did all of it become? And what institutions and what administrative structures, what legacies did these ideas and movements leave behind? The era 3 asks, what did all of it become? What institutions, what administrative structures, what legacies did these ideas and movements leave behind? From 2021 question, they gave us Gandhi's constructive programs during non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement. The extent to which the moderates prepared the base for the wider movement, and the rise and growth of socio-religious reform with a special reference to Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. They asked questions on Gandhian constructive programs, both NCM and CDM, that is non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement. Then they asked the important question, that is moderates prepared the base for the wider movement, sowing the seeds for wider social base. And the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements with a special reference to Young Bengal and Brahmo Samaj. So, wider range of questions they are asking. In 2022, brought two sharp analytical questions. Why the East India Company's armies, mostly Indian soldiers, consistently won against the more numerous, better equipped armies of Indian rulers? And why there was a sudden spurt in famines in colonial India since the mid 18th century? This is most beautiful and important question, and most relevant question of regarding famines. The consequences of British economic colonial policies, that is famines. So these are beautiful questions, brought two sharp and analytical questions. And comes to the 2023, they asked about the difference between Gandhi and Tagore on education and nationalism, and how colonial rule affected the tribals in India, and what their response to colonial oppression looked like. They asked again and Gandhi, this time match with Tagore, on both ideas. One is education and then nationalism. And again, very important question they asked, how colonial rule affected the tribals in India and what their response to colonial oppressions look like. The tribals are important thing in revolt, and peasants also. In 2024 focused on the events that led to the Quit India movement and its results. And 2025 they asked about the ethos of civil service in India as a combination of professionalism and a nationalistic consciousness. This is the third era of questions the way they are asking. So comes to the analysis, the evaluator's underlying question of this whole era. What is this? How did ideas become systems? Underlying question for this whole era. Not what were these ideas, not what were the ideas. That is era number one. Not how did ideas clash. That is era number two. But how did the thinkers, the movements, the conflicts crystallizes into institutions and administrative legacies we can still trace today. So look at the 2025 question again. Civil service ethos, professionalism plus nationalist consciousness. That is literally asking what the freedom movement's ideas about duty, sacrifice, a nation became once they were absorbed into the institutional DNA of independent India's bureaucracy. In era number one, they asked what were the ideas. In era number two, how did ideas clash? But in era number three, how did ideas become systems? So the mental model of for era number three is the full shape, the one I gave you at the start of this segment. That is thinkers, then policies, then social response, then institutional change. Era 3 questions want you to walk the entire chain from the original idea all the way to the institutional outcome. And before we leave the eras, watch one topic move through all three. That is 1857. In era 1, it is asked as a source of emerging grievance. In era 2, it's a watershed and a culmination of the century of rebellions. In era 3, it sits inside questions about what colonial structures and responses became. Same event, three completely different questions. That is whole argument of this session in a single. Comes to the four question families. Till now we have discussed till now we have discussed so far about eras. Then we are going to discuss about question families as far as modern history is concerned. Eras tells you how the exam evolved, but in the exam hall, you don't need to know the year. You need to recognize what kind of question is in front of you in the paper right now. That is where question families come in. I have grouped the 13 years of modern history previous year questions PYQs into four recurring families as far as modern history is concerned. Learn these four and almost every modern history questions slots into one of them are these four question families. And one ground rule here before we start, so it doesn't trip you up later. A few questions belong to two families at once. That's normal and even useful also. It just tells you which angle to lead with and which to bring in as support. Because same theme and same topic they are asked in different type of questions in three eras. So I'll point those out as we go, but don't let it make you think the system is leaky. It is not, absolutely not. The families are recognition tools, not rigid boxes. We are going to start with family number one, that is the thinker's matrix. What is the thinker's matrix here? Gandhi versus Tagore, Gandhi versus Bose, Gandhi versus Ambedkar. The pattern underneath of all three, common goal. What is the common goal? Independence. Then different diagnosis, then different strategies. Whether Tagore, whether Bose, whether Ambedkar and Gandhi. In every one of these, the two figures agree on the destination. Both, that is what, independence. Both want India free. Both want untouchability gone. Both want a just society. What they disagree on is the diagnosis. What actually broken, and therefore the strategy. Take Gandhi and Ambedkar, same goal and end untouchability, but different diagnosis. Gandhi saw it as a moral corruption within Hinduism. Gandhi saw it as a moral corruption within Hinduism to be reformed from inside. But Ambedkar saw it as a structural injustice that moral appeal would never dislodge. So hence different strategy, temple entry and changing hearts on one side, legal and constitutional safeguards on the other, comes to the Gandhi and Ambedkar. So when you see compare two thinkers, don't waste words on both were great, etc. etc. The marks are in where the diagnosis diverged and why that forced different strategies. Please understand this. Then take a second pairing, that is because of the pattern repeats exactly. So that is why we are taking second pairing again. Gandhi and Tagore on nationalism and education. The 2023 question this is. What is here? Same shared capital, both wanted Indians free, dignified, and self-respecting. Again changing the diagnosis. Diagnosis split them. Gandhi diagnosed the disease as economic and moral dependence on the West. So what? So his strategy was self-reliance, the charaka, village industry, and education rooted in manual work and Indian conditions. But Tagore diagnosed the danger differently. He feared nationalism itself could become a narrowing, even violent force, a cage as confining as colonialism. So his strategy was the opposite reflex, an education that opened outward at Shantiniketan, drawing freely from world cultures rather than retreating into the indigenous. Please notice what you are doing when you write it this way. You are not saying Gandhi believed X, Tagore believed Y as two parallel lists. You are showing that the same goal run through different diagnoses, produce two opposite strategies, and that the disagreement was substantive, not personal. That contrast is the answer. The marks live in the divergence, not in the biographies or similarities. They asked in the form of contrast. The answer is contrast. Two different ideologies, two different strategies with the same goal. That should be the answer rather than biographies, similarities. Those are great leaders, etc. etc. So note this family is specifically about comparisons. The single thinker questions like Gandhi's significance today or independence without Gandhi belong with the institutional family instead because they're really about legacy. So they asked about the thinkers family. Then we are moving to family number two, that is socio-economic drain chain. Famines, the decline of artisan industries, British economic policy, industrial collapse, the pattern, the pattern colonial policy, the economic distortion, the social vulnerability. This is belongs to the socio-economic drain chain. This is because of colonial policies where it comes to the economic policies. This is where students lost most marks. Why? because they default to moral outrage rather than the British were exploitative and caused suffering instead of tracing the mechanism. So again, we have to build the chain explicitly. A colonial policy, then forced commercialization of agriculture, shifting land from food crops to cash crops like indigo and cotton, then creates an economic distortion. Then village grain reserves disappear, revenue demands stay fixed regardless of harvest, taxes are fixed taxes are fixed, and that distortion creates social vulnerability. Peasants fall into debt, and famines become more frequent and more severe when droughts hit because the traditional buffers are gone. Policy distortion vulnerability every time because this is cause and effective relationship, because the colonial policies, it leads to consequences like ultimate famines. So this is related the family. The questions have been asked on social economic drain chain, like these families are mostly depending on economic policies of British. So we are moving to family number 3, that is subaltern responses. What is subaltern responses? Tribes, women, workers, the multiple voices of the movement. And 1857. What is the pattern here? The structural pressure, then collective reaction, then suppression of legacy. Here the keyword is collective. These questions are not about individual leaders. They are about how ordinary people, often outside the elite English dedicated leadership, responded to the pressure of colonial structures placed on them. Let me take one example like 1857. The standard mistake is to treat it as a single sudden military mutiny. The structural reading here is the 1857 was the explosion point of 100 years of smaller localized rebellions. Those are sannyasis, Chaur, Santal, each a collective reaction to a specific structural pressure, that is, whether land revenue for tribals, forest restrictions, or military grievances. And the third link matters too. The reaction was suppressed, and that suppression reshaped British policy and left a legacy, which is the exactly handoff into the next family. So, logic for tribals' responses to forest law or women's participation in the struggle ask what structural pressure was applied, what the collective reaction looked like, and what it left behind. So, this is the collective response from the structural pressure which given by British. This is not talking about the educated English elite educated leadership. This is all talking about subalterns. Let me run the full chain on a cleaner case. When it comes to tribal response to colonial rule, the 2023 question that was, start with the structural pressure. What is the structural pressure here? Colonial forest laws and the forest tax. Then redefined land the tribal communities had used for generation as state property. They criminalizing shifting cultivation, hunting, and gathering and the gathering of forest produces. On top of that came the outsiders of colonial economy, pulled in moneylenders, traders, contractors, the Dikus who took land and labor through debit. So that is the pressure. A way of life made illegal their leading number of years from since number of years. And a population made dependent. Now the collective reaction of the of the response of the policies of the British forest acts, This is where you avoid the trap of treating tribals as passive victims. That is Santal rebellion, the Munda uprising under Birsa Munda, the Coal Revolt. These were organized, collective responses, often fusing economic grievance with a religious or millenarian vision of restoring the old order. And then the third link, which weak answers skip entirely, the legacy. The colonial state suppressed these revolts militarily, but it is also responded institutionally. Special protective legislation, the eventually logic of scheduled areas and tribal land protections that you can trace forward into fifth and sixth schedules of the constitution. So the chain runs all the way through structural pressure, collective reaction, suppression, and proactive institutional legacy that outlived the empire. They create one structural pressure in the form of, let's say, the example as far as tribals is concerned. British codified forest laws with the shifting cultivation, hunting, more are those are forest produce, those are criminal activities. So the collect so with the pressure, the tribals wanted to, the way of life of tribals is ruined, has ruined. So they take in the collective reaction and revolt against structural pressure, revolt against British. Then what British has done? The suppression, suppression by British. Then after that protective institutional legacy that outlived the empire. Then again protect institutional legacy. Then form an institution, committee, etc. That is the chain link. That last move connecting a 19th century revolt to a constitutional schedule is exactly the kind of bridge that lifts an answer from narration to analysis. Comes to the family number 4, that is institutional transformation. The civil service, the moderates, the company's military, the quit India movement, Karjan's policies, the transfer of power. The pattern here is ideas, then organization, then administrative legacy. This family is closely tied to Era 3 because it's fundamentally about outcomes rather than process. What organizational or administrative structure did a set of ideas eventually produce? The moderates, for instance, their ideas about constitutional methods, petitions, and gradual reform may have failed in the short term, but they did not win independence. But organizationally, they built the Congress into a functional political institution. And that institution became the vehicle for everything that came after. That is the legacy. In the short term, they won't, they did not succeed. But in the long term, they sowed the seeds for the national independence, nationalism. So that is the legacy. Same with the 2025 civil service question. The ideas of duty and nationalist consciousness that animated the movement did not vanish in 1947. They were organized, embedded into the ethos and training of Indian civil services. That is the administrative legacy. And catch all, because no scheme is airtight. A handful of questions sit across or between these families. The socio-religious reform movements, the Indian Renaissance, a national identity, Karjan, the transfer of power, the fragmented polity of mid-18th century. Don't force them into one box. As I said earlier at the start, as I said at the start, when a question straddles two families, that overlap tells you which angle to lead with and which to bring support. So that is the thing. ideas, organization, administrative legacy. So that is the modern history engine. The modern history engine is bring it all together into one sequence you can run on any modern history question, regardless of era or family. Thinkers, then policies, then social response, then institutional changes. This is the master chain, the same one that opened this segment, the same one era 3 demands in full. And here is the single most important instruction I can give you this entire subject. Do not prepare modern history as an event, then date, then personality. Prepare it as problem, then competing ideas, then mobilization, then institutional outcome, which is the same master chain, said in exam facing language. The problem is the policy or structure. The competing ideas are you thinkers. The competing ideas are your thinkers. Mobilization is a social response of British policies, and the institutional outcome is the institutional change. Comes to 1857, then 1858 Government of India Act. That is the institutional outcome, for example. That is the institutional change. So every time you sit down with a topic, whether it is non-cooperation, whether it is den of wealth, whether it is Indian Renaissance, don't ask what happened and when. Ask what problem existed, what competing ideas emerged in response, how did those ideas mobilize people, and what institution or institutional change, and did what mobilization produce. Answer those four for any topic, and you can write a structurally sound modern history answer, no matter how the question is phrased. Before moving on, please say that chain back to yourself. Problem, competing ideas, mobilization, institutional outcome. If you can't recall it without looking, that is the signal to sit with it before the next subject. The whole session depends on this one being automatic. So, till now we have discussed about modern Indian history regarding eras, families, and how to write a question and answer, and how to prepare total modern Indian history. So we are moving to the next segment, that is post-independence consolidation. From 2013 to 2025, we have to discuss. Now to section, a lot of aspirants this is under prepare, mostly because its presence in the paper fluctuates year to year. Because sometimes they asked, sometimes they did not ask. It does not appear every year. There is no post-independence question in 2014, 19, 2020 or 2024. So the eras we will use track the paper's actual rhythm, not a neat annual cadence here. But when this section does show up, it tends to be a big ticket 10 to 15 marker question. So you cannot afford to be weak here, because 10 to 15 marker question they have been asked. So you cannot afford to be weak here. This is the post independence consolidation. Here is the reframe to internalize before we go further. What type of question asked? UPSC is not asking what happened after independence. It is asking how did India transform freedom into governance capacity after independence, after 1947. So read the distinction carefully. What happened is a list integration of princely states, linguistic reorganization, the Green Revolution, etc. But how did freedom become governance capacity? Is an argument about the mechanism by which a newly independent, fragile, diverse country built the institution muscle to actually govern itself. So every question in this section, food security, state reorganization, foreign policy, is secretly asking some version of the second question, some version of that second question, that is governance part. So one quick note on how I will teach each era. I will give each one a short headline and then a four-step model for actually writing the answer. Because ultimately we are going to write the answer in the examination. That is our thing. That is our goal. So don't worry about the headlines. It's just a label to help you file the era in memory. So the four-step model is the thing you use on the page. So if you only hold on to one thing per era, hold on to the four steps. The era number one, that is 2013 to 2015, that is called as building the republic. Here the four-step model here: challenge, then leadership, then institution, then state formation. Challenge, leadership, institution, state formation. Let me take question from 2013. 2013 was the heavy year here, with 5 questions clustering around this theme: the objectives and success of Vinoba Bhave's Bhudan and Gramdan movements, the evolution and significance of Jai Jawan Jai Kisan, and the contribution of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad to both pre and post independence India, and the circumstances leading to the Tashkent Agreement of 1966, and the compulsions that led India to play a decisive role in the emergence of Bangladesh. And note, please note here, this is the question, this is the 5 questions asked in 2013. The Tashkent and Bangladesh are 1960s and 1970s events asked as 2013 questions. So think about one same principle I will keep flagging. Group by what the question tests, not by when the event happened. Because the questions, the events happened in 1960s and 70s, but the questions asked in 2013. So we have to group by what the question tests, not by the event happened. So then 2015 gave us the Constituent Assembly. How its experience with the Government of India Act of 1935 helped it draft India's constitution in just 3 years. What's the evaluator asking across these questions? They asked, how did India create political legitimacy after colonial withdrawal? Look at what these share: Bhutan and Gramdan, a moral attempt to redistribute land voluntarily, addressing the legitimate gap left by agrarian inequality in those times. So Jai Jawan Jai Kisan, a slogan fusing military and agriculture self-sufficiency into one national identity at a moment of real vulnerability. Azad, a figure bridging the freedom struggle and the new republic, embodying continuity. Come to Tashkent and Bangladesh movements, where India asserted itself as a legitimate sovereign actor managing its own security and diplomacy. And the constitution questions fits too, slightly different. The republic did not build legitimacy from absolute zero. It drew on administrative and constitutional experience already accumulated under the 1935 Act. Legitimacy wasn't built from nothing. It was built by adapting what existed into something new and sovereign. So in this question, they are trying to ask regarding Bhutan Gramdan movement. They asked about the redistribution of agriculture land, agrarian inequality. So redistribution of land. Then Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, they asked about military and agricultural self-sufficiency in that movement. Then Azad, freedom struggle. Then Tashkent and Bangladesh. India asserted itself legitimate and sovereign actor managing. So these type of questions have been asked. So the four-step model in action is: a challenge emerges. like land inequality, then food insecurity, a hostile neighbor, the need for a constitution, then leadership response. That is the challenge, leadership response. Bhave, Shastri, the Constituent Assembly. That leadership builds or adopts an institution, and that institution becomes part of the foundational architecture of the new state. So this is the four-step model, that is challenge, next leadership, then institution, then state. That is the four-step model here. Then comes to the era number 2, that is 2016 to 2021. This is called as integration through accommodation. Then the four-step model here is difference, then accommodation, then integration, then consolidation. Here the four-step model is difference, accommodation, integration, consolidation. If era 1 was about surviving and establishing legitimacy, then era 2 is more specific. How does a country as diverse as India accommodates difference? Linguistic, tribal, regional without that diversity tearing the union part. So comes to the 2016 question, they asked whether linguistic states strengthen the cause of Indian unity. In 2017, they asked about the two major legal initiatives taken since independence to address discrimination against scheduled tribes. In 2018, asked whether the formation of new states recently has been beneficial for India's economy. And 2021, they asked us to access the main administrative issues and socio-cultural problems in integrating the Indian princely states. So the question across this era, how does India absorb diversity without weakening unity? Notice the 2021 princely states question, chronologically it's 1947 to 50, but it is grouped here for what it tests, not what happened during integration. But what does integration tells us about how India handles diversity? The princely states were India's first and most dramatic version of the test. This test, hundreds of distinct political identities absorbed into one nation, into one union. Linguistic states, ST productions, new state formations are the same questions replayed in different contexts. So the four-step model in action, a difference exists here. A princely state's distinct identity, a linguistic community's demand for its own unit, a tribal community's distinct situation. The state finds mechanism to accommodation, instruments of accession, the State Reorganization Commission, then protective legislation for STs. That accommodation leads to integration. The difference becomes part of the union rather than threat to it. And over time, integration consolidates, it becomes stable, accepted part of the how India is organized. So this is the four-step model. Here the four-step model is in the era 2, difference, accommodation, integration, and consolidation. Then we are moving to era number 3, that is 2022 and 2025. That is state capacity and system transformation. The four-step model here, constraint, then policy, the execution, then capability. So 2022 returned to state reorganization but framed as continuous process. The political and administrative reorganization of states and territories ongoing since the mid 19th century. So discussed with the examples. 2023 they asked how India went from a net food importer to 1960s to a net food exporter to the world. And 2025 they asked you to trace India's consolidation in the early phase of independence across polity, economy, education, and international relations. Look at the questions. Please observe the questions. The question here is, how did institution repeatedly redesign India? This is maturest framing in the whole section. It's not about single movement of consolidation. It's consolidation as something that happens again and again in different domains. It responds to different challenges each time, producing a new capability. So take the 2023 food security question. That is green revolution in the popular shorthand. But stop there and you are answering it era 1 and era 2 depth. The era 3 answer traces a sequence. The ship to mouth crisis of the 1960s, dependence on US food aid during droughts and wars, created the pressure. The policy response was an institutional pivot. High yielding variety seeds matched with the new institution like agriculture, crisis commission and the food corporation of India. Then input what? Infrastructure, subsidized tube wells, fertilizers, irrigation, and finally continuous expansion. Then crop diversification. Then operation flood for dairy, an Arctic agriculture export system. Look at the notice the shape, the constraint, ship to mouth crisis, a policy, HYV seeds new institution, execution over decades, imperfectly, and a capability, a self-sufficient, eventually export-oriented agriculture ecosystem. So the model said plainly, a constraint is identified, food insecurity, the need to reorganize states yet again, the need to build foreign policy from scratch. A policy is designed in response, it is executed, often imperfectly, often over decades, and the result is a capability. Something India can now do that it could not before, whether feeding itself, managing internal diversity, or operating the world stage. So the constraint they identified, then a constant reorgan a constant they identified, then ship to mouth crisis, then eventually policy created, then virtual, then working out imperfectly, then capability, then lead to system. So after this we are looking to four question families, just like the modern history, step back from the timeline and organize these into recurring families, patterns you can recognize regardless of year. And the same ground rule applies that I gave you earlier. A few questions, especially the multi-part ones like 2025, belong to more than one family. Don't let that worry you, please. It just tells you which angle to lead with. So, the family number one, integration, reorganization, and consolidation. This is drawing from 2016, 18, 2021, 2022, and 2025. This is mostly regarding princely states, federal redesign, regional aspirations. This is the core family of the subject. It is the through line connecting the integration of the princely states in 1947 to 50 to linguistic reorganization in 1950s to newer states like Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, and Telangana, all the way to the reorganization of Jammu Kashmir. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this thing: state reorganization is not a one-time event that finished in 1956, because it is a continuous process driven by language, regional aspiration, development gaps, tribal identity, running since the mid 19th century and still running today also. When this family appears, your job is to demonstrate that continuity. Then we are moving to family number two, that is crisis institution capacity. Drawing from the agrarian questions from 2013 to 2023, the economic limb of 2025, food security, agrarian transition, the development state. These are the questions belongs to this particular family. What is the pattern here? A crisis exposes a gap in state capacity, and an institution built strengthened to address it. Over time, that institution becomes a part of India's standing capacity. That is Bhutan, the ship to mouth crisis, the broader project of building a development state, all crisis driven institution building to service of a long term capacity. So the crisis, then policy, then evaluation, then development, then institution, then capacity. So family number 3, that is identity, rights, legitimacy. The questions are drawing from 2016, 17, 18. Those are linguistic states, ST protections, new state formations. So the pattern here is a group's identity, that is linguistic, tribal, regional, generates a demand for recognition as rights or administrative status. And granting that recognition becomes a source of legitimacy for the broader union. Proof that the system can accommodate difference without coercion. You will notice that linguistic state sits both the family, this family and family number 1. There is one of those overlaps I warned you about in the earlier. Lead with continuity in the question stresses, reorganization. Lead with recognition of its stress identity. Then family number 4, that is autonomy, diplomacy and strategic reliability. Drawing from the foreign policy questions of 2013, Tashkent and Bangladesh and international relations limb of the 2025 question. What is the pattern here? India assets its anatomy as a sovereign actor, uses diplomacy to manage conflict or crisis, and the outcome contributes to strategic stability. What is this? For India is often for the wider region. So when we running with the 2013 to 2025 questions as far as post independence is concerned, we come across 3 to 4 major families. That is regarding state reorganization. Reorganization means reorganization of states, mostly regarding on. Then economic policies regarding agrarian, green revolution, Pudan movement, etc. And then autonomy regarding questions, family, diplomacy. The those questions are belongs to foreign policy questions. Those are. And then few ST uh, religious rights, few tribal rights, belongs to identity rights legitimacy. These types of questions they have been asked from 2013 to 2025 in post-independence India consolidation. The what is the post-independence engine? Now the full engine is the master sequence underlying this subject. Independence, then integration, then institution building, then development, administrative adaptation, and national capability. So this is the full engine. This is the sequence. I repeat it again. Independence, integration, institution building, development, administrative adaptation, national capability. This chain is longer than modern histories, and that is the deliberate post-independence consolidation is. By definition, a story of accumulation. Each stage doesn't replace the one before. It builds on top of it. Integration of princely states didn't end. When development began, administrative adaptation through reorganization did not stop. When food security was achieved, they are still running simultaneously today also. And here is the takeaway of instruction. Do not prepare this subject as event, the year, then outcome. Prepare it as constraint, then state response, then institution, then long-term legacy. Don't worry that the engine has 6 steps and the exam tip has 4. They are the same idea, just said shorter. You don't need to map them link by link. The 4 step version is simply the engine with the middle stages bundled together for speed. So here is constraint, state response, institution, long-term legacy. So for any topic you taken, you have to you taken Princely states the Green Revolution, evolving foreign policy. Ask what constraints did India face? How did the state respond? What institution emerged? And what is its long-term legacy today? Run that engine on any topic in this subject, and your answer naturally takes the shape of UPSC is looking for. Constraint, state response, institution, long-term legacy. Please notice it is the same shape as modern histories, just wearing different words. That is not a coincidence. It is the point you have to. So we are moving to the next segment and the final segment, that is world history. As far as history segments is concerned, that is global currents and structural legacies. World history has a reputation among aspirants for being vast, unpredictable, and almost impossible to prepare strategically. I want to push back on the reputation today. Because if you look across the 13 years of papers, UPSC is not asking world history as a set of distant foreign events that happened to other countries. It is asking one consistent question, that is, how did global transformations reshape political systems, economies, colonies, and modern institutions? This is the consistent question they have been asked from years. I am repeating the question again. How did global transformations reshape political systems, economies, colonies, and modern institutions? That word reshape is doing a lot of work. This is not describe the French Revolution. This is explain what the French Revolution changed and how that change is still visible today also. One note before we start, same as the last section. World histories also doesn't appear every year. There is no 2020 or 2022 questions in the set. So the eras track the paper's actual rhythm, not a neat annual cadence. And as before, I will give each era a short headline and a four-step model. Use the model, the headline is just the filling label. We are starting with the era number one, that is 2013 to 2015, that is called as industrialization, imperialism, and economic reordering. The four-step model here is production shift, state power, imperial expansion, and social impact. This is the sequence pattern: production shift, state power, imperial expansion, and social impact. So comes to 2013. 2013 was an extraordinarily dense year. Four questions asked. The factors behind Japan's latecomer industrial revolution and how they differed from the Western experience. A question asked on industrial revolution regarding Japan. How Africa was chopped into states artificially by the accident of European competition. Next, the American Revolution as an economic revolt against mercantilism and the policy instruments deployed to contain the Great Depression. These are the questions asked in 2013. Again, 2014 gave us the events leading to the Suez Crisis of 1956 and how we dealt with a final blow to Britain's self-image as world power, plus how Lenin's new economic policy of 1921 influenced the policies India adopted soon after independence. A flag on Suez, it is the outlier. It is this in this economic cluster. Really a strategic decline story rather than a industrialization one, which is why it resurfaced in two families later. Hold that thought. I will brief you. Comes to the 2015, asked why the industrial revolution occurred first in England. What quality of life was like during industrialization and how that compares to India today. Alongside that extent to which Germany can be held responsible for causing two world wars. In 2013, they asked on industrial revolution. Again, 2015, they asked on industrial revolution, but different. In those 2013, they asked regarding Japan. In 2015, they asked regarding England. That is the first time occurred. So the evaluator's question is, across all of these questions, how did economic system reshape global power? Please notice the common thread. Japan's industrialization reshaped the balance of power in Asia. The American Revolution, read as an economic revolt, reshaped the relationship between colony and empire. The Great Depression reshaped with which governments survived and which collapsed. Lenin's new economic policy reshaped not just the Soviet economy, but through its influence on Indian planners. India's own trajectory decades later. Even Suez is fundamentally a strategic story, but Britain's declining capacity to be a project power. So the underlying thing is economy. Economy. With the economy only, you can rule the empire, you can rule the country, or you can rule the global power. You can. So how did economic systems reshape global power? That is the common thread across all these questions which we discussed so far. So the four-step model in action here is a shift in how things are produced. Production shift. Industrial mechanization in Japan or England, or the collapse of production during the depression. So changes underlying power of a state. That changed power either drives imperial expansion, as with Japan and the European powers in Africa, or constants in it, as with Britain after Suez. And all of it lands as social impact, economy, social impact on workers, on colonized populations, on ordinary people living through industrialization. So what we have to understand here is the four-step model: production shift, state power, imperial expansion, and social impact. That is the four-step model here. What is the four-step model here? A shift in how things are produced. Industrial mechanization in Japan or England, or the collapse production during the depression. That is the first production shift. Then we are coming to state power. What is the state power here? Changes underlying power of the state. That changed power either drives imperial expansion, as with Japan and the European powers in Africa, or constrains it, as with Britain after Suez. So imperial expansion. Then after comes to what? Social impact, and all of it leads to as social impact on workers, on colonized populations, and ordinary people living through industrialization. Look at the theory, look at the evolution, look at the observation, look at the underlying point. This is, you have to understand how economy reshape the power. That is the era one. Then era number two, that is 2016 to 2019, that is decolonization, elites modern world foundations. So here is the four-step model here. What? Colonial constraint, educated elite, or labor movement, political mobilization, new identity. For 2016, they asked about the anti-colonial struggles in West Africa, led by a new elite Western educated Africans. In 2017, they asked about the problems germane to decolonization in the Malay Peninsula. experiment to decolonization in the Malay Peninsula. In 2018 asked why the British took indentured labor from India to their colonies and whether that labor force preserved its cultural identity abroad. And 2019 asked how the foundations of the modern world were laid by the American and French revolutions. Look at the questions, observe the questions. What is the evaluators question here? Evaluators question here is how did ideas, elites, colonial movements create new states? Look at the pattern. In West Africa, it's specifically a Western educated elite, people who absorbed the colonial power's own ideas about rights, citizenship, and self-determination, and then turned those ideas against colonialism itself. Comes to in the Malay Peninsula, decolonization creates a new political order, but one with built-in problems: ethnic composition, ethnic dependency, geopolitical positioning that the new state has to navigate. Indentured labor is about diaspora created by colonial economic needs and whether it could carry its identity into a new context. And the American and French revolutions are quite literally the ideational foundation, the source of the very ideas about rights and citizenships that West African elites and Malay nationalists would later deploy. So the four-step model here is in action. A colonial constraints exist, that is direct to rule, plantation economies, indentured labor systems. After that constraint exists, what next? That is educated elite or labor movement emerges. Within that constraint, it mobilizes politically, and the outcome is new identity, a new nation, and a new diaspora community, a new political order that did not exist in that from before, that did not exist in that form before. Then comes to era number 3, that is 21 to 25, 2021 to 2025. This is also known as systemic fragility, global, local linkages, enduring legacies. This is the era you most likely to be examined under. So let's go through it carefully. The four-step model here is crisis, ideology, technology, war, then institutional change and contemporary relevance. In 2021, question asked us evaluate the statement that a serious challenge arose to the democratic state system between the two world wars. 2023, they asked to bring about socio-economic effects of the introduction of railways in the different countries. 2024 was a double year. First, how far the industrial revolution in England was responsible for the decline of handicrafts and cottage industries in India. And second, how far it's correct to say the First World War was fought essentially for the preservation of the balance of power. And 2025 asked us to explain the enduring relevance of French Revolution to the contemporary world. In 2024, you have to observe one thing very carefully. They linked with global to regional. That is, how far industrial revolution in England was responsible for the decline of handicrafts and cottage industries in India. Look at the observation, look at the linkage. Please look at the linkage, you have to understand. What is the evaluator question across this whole era? Why do historical crises continue to shape the modern world? This is the most demanding framing in the subject because it requires something most students don't do. Connect an event from 1 or 2 centuries ago today. Not what happened in the interwar period, but why does that period still matter for how we think about democratic fragility now? Not what were the effects of railways, but what does that tell us about how technology reshapes societies, including today's? Not what did the French Revolution achieve, but why is still relevant. That is the thing you have. You have to understand linkage is need of the hour. That is what UPSC is asking from these many questions, these linkages. Take 2021 interwar question because it's the perfect template for this era. The temptation is just to list Germany, Italy, and the rise of fascism. But the structural answer goes further. The economic shock waves of the 1929 Great Depression caused hyperinflation and mass unemployment, which delegitimized fragile democratic institutions like the Weimar Republic, creating a political vacuum that totalitarian movements exploited through hyper-nationalist rhetoric. That is the mechanism: economic shock, institutional delegitimization, political vacuum, ideological exploitation. And that mechanism is not historical curiosity. It is a lens you can apply to any period where economic crisis threatens democratic institutions, which is exactly why the question carries the enduring legacy. Because it is not depending on the times. Any time you have take a you take you have to take economic crisis, then it almostly threatens to democratic institutions, whether it comes to unemployment, whether it comes to hyperinflation, whether it comes to depression, etc. So economic shock always leads to institutional delegitimization, political vacuum, and ideological exploitation, irrespective of times. So the four-step model in action: a crisis occurs, economic collapse, a new technology like railways, a world war. It interacts with ideology, technology, or warfare to produce institutional change, new political movements, new economic structures, and new international orders. And that change has contemporary relevance. Not just history, but a pattern that recurs or whose effects persist. This is the four-step model in action. Then we are moving to four question families. As within as with the other two subjects, let's reorganize these into families you can recognize regardless of fear. And the same ground rule applies here. A couple of questions sit at interaction or intersection of two families. That is the signal telling you which angle to lead with, irrespective of families. So comes to the family number one, that is a revolution, ideology, modern institutions. The American Revolution, French Revolution, Lenin's new economic policy, and the modern world foundations question or belongs to this family. What is the underlying pattern here? Old order, economic or political crisis, new ideology, institutional legacy. This is the order. An old order mercantilist colonial rule, the French monarchy, Tsarist Russia, faces a crisis. So a new ideology emerges in response of economic liberalism and republicanism. Liberty, equality, fraternity, a pragmatic state-directed model of economic reconstruction, respectively. And that ideology leaves an institutional legacy that outlasts the original revolution by centuries. Modern constitutionalism, human rights frameworks, even in the case of NEP, that is new economic policy, sorry, new education policy, new economic policy, influence on Indian economic planning, decades later, an ocean way from the Lenin. So comes to the family number two, that is industrialization, imperialism, and social dislocation. The industrial revolution, Japan's industrial revolution, the Japan's industrialization, railways, Indian handicrafts, and Indian child labor comes to this family, belongs to this family. What is the pattern here? Technology or production shift, market expansion, colonial extraction, and social consequence. A technology shift to merchandised textiles, railway construction expands market, then colonial powers use that expanded access for extraction, flooding India with a Lancashire cotton, reorganizing colonial economies around raw material export, and the social consequences fall on the colonized population. The decline of handicrafts and displacement of artisans onto already overburdened agriculture sector. The creation of indentured labor diaspora. So this is we already discussed in the eras. That is production shift then leads to economic power, then market expansion, then imperial expansion, then leads to social impact. So that is the technology product shift, market expansion, colonial extraction, then social consequence. This is the sequence. This family connects directly back to the socio economic brain chain from modern Indian history. So they are describing the same underlying process viewed from the global and the domestic side respectively. And that is the clearest proof that these are not four separate frameworks, but one analytical habit applied to different content. So you have to visualize parallelly when comes to world history with modern Indian history. Sometimes you have to compare, sometimes you have to similar discussion is need of the hour. Then we are moving to family number three, that is war balance of power, democratic fragility. The world wars, the interwar crisis, the Great Depression, the Germany question, and the Suez crisis. These are belongs to this family. The pattern here is underlying geopolitical competition, economic shock, institutional breakdown, power reordering. Geopolitical competition for colonies, resources, strategic position produces economic shocks, obviously, whether through war or depression. These shocks cause institutional breakdown, the collapse of Weimar Republic, the erosion of Britain's standing after Suez, and the results of reordering of power, new dominant states emerge, the new international structures, a changed balance of power, obviously. So economic shocks leads to institutional breakdown, leads to power, leads to emergence of new dominant states. The 2015 Germany question and 2024 First World War question both live here. They are asking you to weigh how far one actor or the balance of power system itself drove global conflict. So comes to the family number four, that is decolonization, elites state formation. So West Africa, Malay Peninsula, Africa's artificial boundaries, and again the Suez crisis, which sits in the intersection of the two families. 2013 Africa question does the same thing. It is an imperial expansion story in era 1 and the roots of post-colonial problem story here. So don't be surprised to meet it twice. The pattern is colonial boundary, then anti-colonial mobilization, then elite leadership, then post-colonial problem. Here colonial boundary often run arbitrarily for imperial convenience rather than the local logic. So colonial boundaries often drawn arbitrarily for imperial convenience rather than local logic, becomes the territory of a future state. Anti-colonial mobilization, often led by an educated elite, achieves independence within that boundary, but the boundary itself drawn of colonial rather than local reasons. So frequently becomes a source of post-colonial problems, ethnic tensions, weak national cohesions, contested borders. This is all belongs to this family. This is all types of questions like decolonization, elite state formations belong to this family. So what is the world history engine? Now the full engine for this subject: global shock, the economic transition, then social disruption, then political transformation, and institutional legacy. This is a 5-step chain, slightly longer than modern history's 4, and the extra step that is political transformation. This is the point here. World history more than the other two subjects which we discussed earlier, that is modern Indian history and post independent consolidation, accepts you to show the economic and social changes eventually translate into political change. New states, new ideologies, new international orders before setting into a institutional legacy. So, and here's the takeaway instruction: do not prepare world history as a country, then event, then date. Prepare it as global change, then social impact, then political response, then modern legacy. Same as before. Don't fret, the engine has 5 steps and tip has 4. They are the same ideas set shorter within the economic social stages folded together into one. You don't need to track it link by link. So for any world history topic, whether it comes to French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, decolonization Africa, ask first yourself what global change occurred, what social impact did it have, especially on colony side or peripheral societies. What political response did that impact to provoke? And what is the modern legacy of that response? Something we can still point to today. This is the way to prepare for the world history topic. Answer these 4 and you have turned a vast and unpredictable world history into exactly the same kind of structured analytical answer as modern history and post independence consolidation. Same engine, same discipline, different content. So please notice this: global change, social impact, political response, modern legacy. 3 subjects now, 3 engines, and you can feel they are the same machine. Hold that feeling. We are about to name it. We are moving to segment number 5, that is answer writing engine. To close out the teaching, we are not going to look at another PYQ. We are going to talk about execution. We have discussed so far about 3 subjects, and here is why this segment matters as much as everything that came before it. Knowledge does not become marks automatically. You can now know everything we have discussed so far, every era, every family, every engine, and still write an answer that scores poorly. If that knowledge is not structured on the page, history rewards organized thinking, not just informed thinking, organized thinking. So let us build the engine for that. What is the history answer engine? The master sequence is very simple, and I want you to memorize it as 3 words: context, the structure, the legacy. Every history answer, whether it's a 10 marker or 150 word answer or a 15 marker 250 word answer, moves through these 3 stages. The scale changes how much you can fit, not the shape. In a 150 worder, you will run 2 dimensions tightly. In 250 worder, 3 with room to develop each. Same engine either way. Let's take the 3 stages on one at a time. So step 1, context, that is introduction. The purpose of your introduction is to place the answer. The purpose of your introduction is to place the answer to tell the examiner, here is the moment in history we are discussing, and here is the central tension that makes this moment worth discussing. There are 2 things and only 2 things your introduction needs to do: anchor the historical moment and state the central tension. That's it. What it should never do is repeat the question back in slightly different words. That is not the context. That is the padding. What you have to do is anchor the historical moment and state the central tension in the introduction. Let me show you the difference simply. Suppose the question is about the role of the moderates. A weak introduction like this. The moderates were the leader of the Indian National Congress. That is a fact, it's true. And it ends almost nothing because it anchors nothing and states no tension. But a strong introduction says like this. The moderate phase from 1885 to the Surat split of 1905 to 1907 transformed fragmented resistance into organized constitutional nationalism. Please notice here what that does. It anchors the movement, a specific phase with specific boundaries, and it states the central tension, the transformation of something fragmented and unorganized into something structured and constitutional. That single sentence has already told the examiner what the rest of your answer is about. The shift from fragmentation to organization. And if you prefer to close the phrase at the 1907 Surah split rather than 1905, that's equally accepted. Just to be consistent, that's it. The formula here is timeline plus structural shift. Give the examiner a time period and tell them what changed within it. That is your introduction in one or two sentences. Don't overwrite it. This is the introduction. Anchor, central tension. Then comes to the step 2, that is structure the body. The purpose of the body is to convert information into evaluation. And here is the single most common mistake aspirants make. They wrote chronology. They tell the story beginning to end as a narrative. Please don't do that. Instead, build dimensions. Instead of that, build dimensions. What kinds of dimensions? Political, economic, social, institutional, and strategic. Pick the 2 or 3 most relevant to your specific question and organize your body around those only. In a 250 word answer, a short subheader per dimensions can work. In a 150 word answer, skip the headers. Directly they eat word count. So, and use a clear topic sentence to open each dimensions instead. Either way, this does two things. It makes your answer easy for the examiner to follow and avoid mark, and it forces you to think analytically rather than recalls facts in sequence. So you have to be very careful about wording and word count and headers. So, and within each dimension, use this micro pattern: cause, then response, then outcome. Simple. Notice that the same shape as the engine we have been building all session, just zoomed into a single paragraph. The whole subject runs on one habit at every scale. A concrete example, say you are discussing the social dimension of the expansion of the national movement. So here the cause is agrarian distress, peasants under economic pressure. The response is peasant mobilization, Keda and Bardoli, no tax campaigns. And that outcome is the expansion of nationalist politics. So agrarian grievance becomes part of the mainstream political agenda, not just an isolated rural issue. Cause, response, outcome. Cause, what is the cause here? Tax. Response, movement, Kedar Bardoli. Why? What is the cause here? Agrarian distress because of peasant economic pressure, no tax movement in the form of Keda Bardoli in the response. Then outcome what? Agrarian grievance become part of main political agenda, not an isolated rural issue. Then task campaigns, they solved. That is the outcome. So apply that inside every dimensions you can write. Cause, response, outcome. And here's the test for whether you are succeeded or not. Your answer should feel engineered, not narrated. If your body reads like a story told from beginning to end, you have written chronology. If it reads like a series of analytical claims, each backed by cause response outcome chain and organized by dimension, that is the structure. We need not a chronology. We don't need chronology. We need structure. That is what we get marks. So comes to the step 3, that is legacy, the conclusion. The purpose of your conclusion is to move beyond summary. So let me be very blunt. A conclusion that just restates your body in compressed form in wasted space. That is wasted. The examiner has just read your body. They don't need it again. Instead of that, your conclusion should answer 3 questions. What changed? What survived? And what became institutional? This is what I call the legacy bridge. You connect the historical outcome you have just discussed to its long term structural legacy, or to its modern constitutional or institutional equivalent. So that is the need of here. That is the need here. Comes to the weak versus strong again. Concluding and answer the socio-religious reform movements. Let's take example. A weak conclusion says like this. Thus the reform movement was important, not wrong, just empty. Important tells that examiner nothing they don't already know from your body. This is the simple weak conclusion. So comes to the strong conclusion. The strong conclusion says like this. The reform movements expanded beyond social awakening and fed into the constitutional imagination of equality and justice. Look at this. See what that does. It takes something historical, 19th century socio-religious reform, and connects it to something present to the constitutional values that govern India today. That is the bridge. Past to institutional legacy to present meaning. So every conclusion you write should attempt that the same bridge. Take the historical phenomena, take the historical, you have discussed and connected it. Explicitly something that persists. An institution, a constitutional value, a contemporary debate. The final execution formula here, let's put the whole engine together, end to end. Facts, then context, the structure, then evaluation, then answer. Facts, the context, the structure, facts, then context, then structure, then evaluation, then answer. And see how this constrains the 3 word sequence rather than replacing it. Facts are the raw material, the dates, names, and events from the previous 3 segments. Context, structure, and legacy are the 3 word spine in action. Context is your introduction, structure is your body, and legacy lives inside evaluation, the assessing, connecting, and weighing you do throughout, which culminates the legacy bridge the end. The sum of all it is the answer. So facts alone are not answer. Facts placed context organized through structure lifted by evaluation, that is an answer. Run the engine on any question in this paper, and what you hand the examiner is no longer a story, it is an argument. So structure, facts, introduction, context, introduction, structure, body, then conclusion. Conclusion means evaluation. So after the segment, final segment, that is engine running live, that is segment number 6. Everything so far has been the engine described. Let me now run it in front of you, start to finish. That is on a real question. So you see it produce the actual answer rather than just a diagram. I will take a question we have already discussed so far. So the content is familiar you, and you can watch the structure, not the facts. Let me take the one question PYQ, that is, to what extent did the role of the moderates prepare a base for the wider freedom movement? That is the 2021 paper question, 250 words, 15 marks. A to what extent question is a verdict question. To what extent in the question is verdict question. It is asking you to weigh, not to list. Keep that in mind. It shapes everything because directive what is need of the hour. When the understanding the directive what, then you can move to write the answer. What is the introduction? Start with the context. The introduction. The weak version, remember, just identifies the who moderates are were. But we don't do that. That is the weak introduction. What is, we anchor and we state attention. That's it. For that, what we have to do is the moderate phase from the founding of the Congress in 1885 to Surat split of 1905 to 1907 is often dismissed as timid petitions and prayers that want little, that want little, yet judged by what is built rather than what it immediately achieved. It laid the institutional and ideological base on which mass nationalism was later raised. Look at that, please look at that. Notice what that does in two sentences. It anchors the period, it states the tension, dismissed as failure versus judged as foundation. And that phrase to what extent is already answered in embryo. Substantially but indirectly. The examiner knows your verdict and your reasoning will follow. Comes to the structure. The body built as dimensions. Each running cause response outcome, not a story dimensions. First dimension institutional. The cause. There was no all India political organization through which Indian opinion could be expressed. The response. The moderates built one. The Congress itself annual sessions, a national platform that for the first time gathered dedicated Indians from every province. What is the outcome? When the militant Gandhian phases came, they did not have to invent a vehicle. The vehicle already exists. That's preparation based concretely. So second dimension is ideological and economic. What is the cause here? Colonial rule was justified even by many Indians as broadly beneficial. What is the response? The moderates Nauroji Dutt Nanade produced economic critique of the empire. The drain theory, the documentation of how British policy impoverished India. What is the outcome here? This gave the latter movement its intellectual ammunition. Mass mobilization needs a grievance people believe in the systematic, not accidental. And the moderates supplied exactly that proven endpoint. You could add third dimension also. The political method, constitutionalism, training a generation in public government and legislative work. But what's the word count in 250 words? Two developed dimension plus a sharp conclusion beats three rushed ones. The resistant is itself a skill. Restraint is itself a skill. Because if you suffice with two dimensions with sharp conclusion, enough rather than three. So now the legacy part. The conclusion, the bridge, not a summary. We answer what changed, what survived, what became institutional. So the moderates failed at their stated aim. They did not win self rule, and the next generation rejected their methods as inadequate. For the organization they founded, the economic critique they established, The political vocabulary they created all survived their political eclipse. The Congress what won independence in 1947 was structurally the institution they built in 1885. To what extent the base they prepared was decisive, not in spite of their apparent failure, but underneath it. See the bridge from an 1885 organization to 1947 independence, past connected explicitly to outcome, and that to what extent verdict delivered with a clear defensible position. This is the way of writing the answer to what extent regarding verdict question. That is the whole engine in one answer. Context that anchors tension structures built as dimensions. Each dimension has cause response outcome chain. Then legacy that bridges to what endured. No chronology, no list, no both sides were important. An argument. And here is the thing I most want you to take from watching it run. I did not need to know anything you don't already know. Nothing in that answer required rare facts. The difference was not information. The difference was organization. That is the entire promise of the session. The marks were never hiding in rare facts. They were hiding in the shape of the answer. So stop reading history. So stop reading history as a story. Start reading history as a system. Here is what I most want you to carry out in this room across four very different bodies of content. That is modern Indian history, post-independence consolidation, world history, and the answer writing itself. We ran the same engine every single time. Different content, one habit. Modern history asks how ideas become institutions. Post-independence asks how freedom became governance capacity. World history asks how global shocks reshaped the modern world. And every answer you write turns context into structure into legacy. Four subjects, one engine. That was the whole point. You cite mostly, most clearly in one place. The drain chain. The decline of Indian handicrafts shows up in modern history as a domestic story and in world history as a global one. The same process seen from two sides. Once you can see that, you stop preparing four subjects and start preparing one way of thinking. So organize your preparation around the engines, not around isolated topics. For any topic, any of these subjects, run the chain. What caused the change? What competing ideas emerged in response? Who mobilized and how? And what institutional legacy did it leave behind? If you remember nothing else, the three beat shorthand in this: cause, response, legacy. But push for full four whenever the word counts lets you. That is how you stop memorizing the history. That is how you start thinking like an analyst. And that is how you write answers UPSC can reward. Keep building structure, keep building precision. UPSC fail, UPSC will set the question. Your preparation decides whether they look random. Go build your engine. That is the work.